Before we start the video, make sure to subscribe to our channel, The Forgotten Files. Also, drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. Alright, let's get started. In the winter of 1856, weeks before Christmas, a group of hunters found something in the swamps of western Tennessee, a set of iron shackles torn apart by bare hands. Not rusted, not cut, split. And beside them lay a plantation registry with one name smeared in dried blood. Jacob Terrell. The official story claimed he disappeared. The local church claimed he ascended. The county records said he never existed. But every year, families along the forked Deer River whispered what their grandparents had sworn they saw. A towering black man, eyes dark as river mud, walking silently along the tree line. Chains dragging behind him, though no chains remained. For almost 2 centuries, historians refused to document the event. Churches burned testimonies. Families moved states to forget it. Because the story of Jacob Terrell wasn't just about strength. It was about what that strength revealed. About what it uncovered inside men who believed themselves masters, inside elders who believed themselves righteous, inside a town that believed it could bury truth beneath God, soil, and bone. And it all began on a plantation whose real name no document dares record. A place locals now call only the 12 Fields. Because 12 men tried to restrain Jacob Terrell, and not one of them made it to dawn. Rutherford County, Tennessee, was built on silence. The kind that lived in pews, kitchens, and schoolhouses, an inherited silence passed from fathers to sons. In 1856, the town had only 3 institutions that mattered: the church, the courthouse, and the plantation. All 3 were run by men whose portraits still hang in private attics, faces blackened by time until the eyes seem hollowed out. But there was one building even locals never approached after sunset. The East Seminary for Boys, a wooden structure that leaned as if listening. Locals claimed the seminary bell rang at night on its own, even after the rope was removed. The pastor said it was just the wind. But older families knew better. They whispered that the bell first rang the night Jacob Terrell arrived at the plantation. He hadn't been bought. He had been delivered, wrapped in federal paperwork, and accompanied by a pale government agent who told the overseers, "This one is not to be trained. He is to be watched." Nobody asked why. Because the plantation owner, Elijah Moore, had ties, quiet ties, to Washington, Charleston, and even Philadelphia seminaries known for their strange experiments on physical endurance. Jacob was not the first. He was simply the first who survived arrival. And from the moment he stepped onto the dirt, the town knew something had changed. A heaviness, a pressure, like a storm building beneath the soil itself. Jacob Terrell was unlike anyone the plantation had seen. Tall, nearly 7 feet by some accounts. Shoulders broad enough to shadow a doorway. Yet his voice was gentle, quiet, almost distant. What terrified the overseers wasn't his size. It was his stillness. He never flinched when struck, never cried out, never showed hunger, thirst, or fear. Elijah Moore ordered the overseers to test him, a phrase everyone understood but never repeated. They tried the hardest labor first. Jacob completed it without breathing hard. They tried isolation. Jacob stayed silent. They tried sleep deprivation. Jacob rested standing, eyes open. Overseers grew uneasy. "He watches us," one said. "He listens," another whispered. By the second week, the men complained that Jacob knew things, what they said behind barns, what they hid in their coat pockets, even the names of children they never mentioned aloud. Jacob never claimed to know. He simply looked at them in a way that made each man feel stripped of skin, pride, and all the lies he had told himself to sleep at night. There was talk, dangerous, blasphemous talk, accusing Jacob of being something other than human, something sent. Elijah Moore, furious, decreed that Jacob would be disciplined properly. 12 overseers volunteered, not because they were brave, but because each one feared what would happen if they said no. Pastor Hammond had preached for 28 years at the white clapboard church on Briar Road, a place where sins were confessed only when convenient and forgotten when necessary. But the pastor kept a secret ledger, hidden beneath the altar, recording things he could never speak aloud. One entry, dated November 3rd, 1856, read, "The new man sees. I feel it when he walks past the church. He knows the sins of this whole town. God forgive what is coming. Hammond had been warned years earlier during a seminary visit to Washington that certain federal cases might pass through rural properties. Do not interfere, the officials told him. One day you will understand. But Hammond did not want to understand. Because he had heard rumors, unholy rumors, of experiments hidden beneath universities, of bodies taken from poor black cemeteries for research, of New York physicians studying muscular anomalies in northern prisons. And some whispered that Jacob was the result of something attempted before the Civil War even had a name. Something that was never supposed to walk into the light. The pastor begged Elijah Moore to release the man. Moore laughed. He's stronger than anything I've ever seen. If the government wants him, I intend to know why. Hammond left the plantation shaking. By nightfall, he wrote one final warning in his ledger. Do not attempt to restrain him. You are not binding a man. You are binding judgment. It started just after midnight. 12 overseers, drunk, armed, and desperate to prove themselves loyal to Moore, gathered around Jacob's cabin. Jacob was seated when they entered, hands folded, as if expecting them. He said only one sentence. This is not my night to suffer. The men lunged. The cabin shook. Witnesses from nearby quarters swore they heard the walls groan like something alive. By morning, the cabin door was off its hinges. The ground was torn. Splintered boards lay everywhere. And 12 sets of broken tools, whips, and iron restraints were scattered like leaves. The overseers were found in the clearing, alive but unable to speak, bodies trembling as if their bones no longer remembered how to hold shape. 2 men's hair had turned white. 3 refused ever to look at Jacob again. 1 kept repeating the same words for the rest of his life. He touched nothing. He moved nothing. But we couldn't hold him. Jacob walked out of the cabin unmarked. Not a bruise. Not a scratch. He simply stepped past Elijah Moore, who stood frozen on the porch, and whispered, "Your sins are not hidden anymore." For the first time in his life, Moore felt fear that didn't come from a weapon. Fear that came from being seen. 2 days after the incident, federal agents arrived at the East Seminary for Boys, an institution long rumored to serve purposes beyond education. Behind classroom walls hung portraits of theologians. Beneath the floors lay something else entirely. A locked archive containing documents labeled with single letters, A, B, C, D. Jacob's file was marked S3. The records told a story nobody outside government labs and seminaries ever knew. For decades, secret programs explored how trauma, starvation, and spiritual conditioning affected human strength. Poor black communities were targeted. Bodies were used without consent. Jacob had survived an experiment meant to break every part of him. But instead, something awakened in him. Something the scientists could not measure and deeply feared. Something older than their theories. A doctor wrote, "Subject does not respond to pain. Subject does not sleep normally. Subject perceives emotional states with unnatural accuracy. Subject should not be provoked." The seminary demanded Jacob be transferred to an isolated plantation to avoid public attention. But they gave one warning. If restraint becomes necessary, remember, you are not restraining a man. You are restraining the trauma of generations made flesh. The plantation ignored the warning, and the seminary closed its doors, because the men inside believed the event they feared most had already begun. Before dawn on November 7th, a group of enslaved children gathering water claimed they saw Jacob walking toward the woods. They described him differently than adults did. Not terrifying, not monstrous, but sad. One girl said, "He looked like someone who lost something." Another boy added, "He wasn't running. He was listening to the trees." The children followed at a distance. They swore the forest grew silent as he walked. Not even birds moved. When Jacob reached the riverbank, he placed his hand on the water as if checking its temperature. Then he whispered something the children never forgot. Blood remembers. Moments later, a horn sounded from the plantation. Elijah Moore sending riders to retrieve him. Jacob looked back only once. His expression wasn't fear or anger. It was pity, as if he knew the men chasing him had already sealed their fate long before he arrived. The riders caught up at the edge of the swamp. Jacob did not fight. He simply stepped aside. The horses bucked violently, throwing the men into the mud. None could explain it. The children ran home screaming, telling their parents that Jacob talked to the river, and the river answered. Adults dismissed it as childish imagination, but deep down, many wondered. What if the natural world recognized him in a way people refused to? Elijah Moore, long known for his cruelty, became increasingly unstable after Jacob's escape from the cabin incident. He drank heavily. He preached loudly to no one. He patrolled the fields with a rifle, muttering that Jacob was the devil's messenger. But the truth was simpler. Jacob terrified Moore because Jacob saw him. Saw the murders he hid behind Scripture. Saw the children he sold under cover of night. Saw the whitewashed lies he told his wife, his church, and himself. Elijah hated nothing more than being known. So he ordered the 12 overseers, broken and shaking, to capture Jacob again. 3 refused. Moore shot 2 of them. The rest obeyed. But Moore made one fatal mistake. He didn't understand that Jacob wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment when the plantation's lies, sins, and buried secrets finally cracked open. Waiting for the moment the land itself stopped protecting Elijah Moore. And that moment came on a night when the river rose higher than it had in decades, swallowing fences, barns, and the last illusions of control Moore ever had. The 11 remaining overseers, one had vanished after the first encounter, gathered near the barn at Moore's command. They were men once feared, loud, brutal, proud. Now they were hollowed out, trembling at shadows. One refused to hold a weapon. Another kept mumbling, "He didn't touch us. He didn't touch us." Yet Moore screamed at them, calling them cowards, weaklings, failures. He forced iron restraints into their hands. "Tonight we end this," he barked. But the men knew something Moore didn't. They had seen Jacob up close. They had felt something, an invisible weight pressing on their chests, a presence that wasn't violence, but something worse. Judgment. Still they marched, because fear of Moore had shaped their whole lives. And terror of Jacob ruled their nights. What they didn't understand was that Jacob wasn't their enemy. He was the mirror they had avoided their entire lives. And mirrors, once shattered, reveal pieces you can never put back. The men entered the swamp to hunt Jacob. But the deeper they walked, the more they realized the darkness around them wasn't just night. It was memory, their own, rising like steam off the water. And Jacob was waiting in the heart of it. The Forked Deer River swamp was older than any town, any church, any plantation. Local tribes once warned settlers never to enter the center marsh at night, calling it the place where grief breathes. Moore dismissed the stories as superstition, but the 11 overseers felt that breathing grief as soon as they stepped into the water. The swamp whispered, not words, but impressions. A child crying, a mother begging, a prayer cut short. The overseers staggered, gripping their heads, feeling memories not their own flowing through them like cold wind. Jacob stood waist-deep in the water, facing them, unmoving. He didn't raise a hand. The swamp did the rest. Vines curled around ankles. Branches snapped under invisible weight. Reflections in the water shifted, showing not the men themselves, but the people they had harmed. One overseer screamed and fled. Another fell to his knees, sobbing, calling Jacob Sir, Master, Father, anything that might save him. But Jacob only said, "This is not punishment. This is memory." The swamp was not attacking. It was revealing, and the men could not bear to see the truth. Henry Calhoun, the youngest overseer, was the first to lose coherence. He had joined the plantation at 17, desperate to prove himself to older men. Jacob looked at him with something like sorrow. Henry dropped his weapon. "I didn't want to hurt no one," he whispered. "You did," Jacob replied softly. "You hurt because you feared being small." A flood of memories crashed over Henry. Times he struck people only because he was afraid he wasn't strong enough, respected enough, feared enough. He saw his father beating him. He saw himself repeating that violence. Henry waded deeper into the swamp as if trying to drown the visions. No one followed. No one called out. He disappeared beneath the black water without a splash. Jacob bowed his head. "Fear consumes itself," he said. The remaining 10 stared at him, not with hatred, but with a dread that tasted like truth. They realized then that they were not in the swamp to capture Jacob. They were there to confront themselves. A task no whip, no gun, no shouting master could ever prepare them for. The second and third men collapsed moments later, one convulsing, the other ripping his shirt as if something crawled beneath his skin. They weren't being harmed physically. They were drowning in memory. All their cruelty, every lash, every order, every night they told themselves they were just doing their job. rose like water around their throats. Jacob stepped toward them, but did not touch them. "You could have chosen differently," he said. "You were never slaves to more. You chained yourselves to him." The men screamed at Jacob to stop speaking, to stop seeing them, to stop knowing them. Because truth was the one thing these men could never bear. By dawn, only 6 remained standing. Their eyes were wide, pupils dilated, breath shaking as if pulled through a cracked lung. They no longer cared about more, about orders, about punishment. They wanted only to escape the swamp. But the path behind them had vanished beneath rising water. The swamp was not letting them leave, because the past they tried to bury had finally caught up. And Jacob was not the executioner. He was the witness. For the first time, Jacob spoke at length. His voice was calm, deep, heavy with something the men didn't recognize. Not anger, but history. "I was taken at 11, he said. "Not by slavers. By men in white coats." The overseers flinched. Jacob continued. "They wanted to know how much suffering a body can hold, how much pain a mind can swallow, how long a soul can be denied its own voice." He looked at each man, but they learned nothing, because they asked the wrong question. The 4th overseer fell to his knees. Jacob stepped closer. "The question isn't how strong a man can be. The question is what happens when the suffering of many becomes the strength of one." The swamp stirred, as if nodding. "Their experiments did not create me," he said. "They awakened what your world tried to kill in every black child, every mother, every father for centuries. Memory, endurance. The strength you fear is not mine alone. It is ours." The men trembled uncontrollably, because they realized Jacob wasn't supernatural. He was simply the truth made flesh. The remaining overseers attempted one final attack, not out of loyalty to more, but out of pure, spiraling terror. They rushed Jacob from 6 directions, but when they moved, the swamp shifted with them. Mud turned to quicksand. Branches cracked under invisible force. One man sank to his waist instantly. Another dropped his weapon and began apologizing to no one in particular. Jacob stepped backward, letting the swamp decide their fate. He spoke quietly. "You cannot attack what reflects your own heart." The men froze. Those words hit harder than any physical blow. For years they had justified every cruelty as orders. Now they saw themselves as they truly were, frightened children hiding behind power. Jacob did not strike them. The swamp simply exposed them. By dawn, only 2 survived, barely conscious, clinging to a fallen log. They would later be found wandering the woods, unable to speak, unable to remember their own names. But they remembered Jacob. They remembered the truth he forced into their bones. And they would spend the rest of their lives avoiding mirrors. While the overseers fell, Elijah more prepared for war. He barricaded his home, gathered rifles, and prayed not to God but to the version of God he believed protected men like him. A God who blessed violence as long as it maintained order. His wife begged him to stop. His daughter hid in the attic. But more was certain Jacob was coming for him. He paced the halls, muttering that no experiment would ever outmatch him. At midnight, he heard a knock. Not on the door, on the wall of his house. A slow, deliberate knock, traveling from room to room as if someone walked through the walls themselves. Moore fired blindly. The knocks grew louder. His wife screamed for him to stop. But the house groaned, beams cracking as if something pressed down from the roof. Moore ran outside and froze. Jacob stood at the gate, calm, silent, waiting. But it wasn't Jacob that terrified Moore. It was the 100 faces behind him. Not physical bodies, but memories, sorrows, injustices made visible through Jacob's presence. Moore fired. The bullet fell harmlessly at Jacob's feet. Because the truth cannot be shot. Jacob approached Moore slowly, without anger. Moore screamed, threatened, cursed. But Jacob simply said, "Confess." Moore tried to run, but every direction he turned, the shadows of those he had harmed blocked his path. Not bodies, not ghosts, just the weight of memory given form. Jacob repeated, "Confess." Moore collapsed to his knees, shaking violently. He confessed everything. The beatings, the murders, the sales, the children taken from mothers, the rituals held in the church with Pastor Hammond's knowledge, the government men who paid him for subjects, the experiments hidden in barns and cellars, the lies he told from the pulpit about God's order. He confessed until his voice broke. Jacob listened in silence. When Moore finally stopped, Jacob said, You chained others to hide the chains inside your own soul. More begged for mercy. Jacob frowned. There is no mercy. There is only truth. More fainted, and when he awoke, Jacob was gone. But Moore was no longer a powerful man. He was a hollow one. The next morning, the plantation was silent. The 12 overseers were gone or broken. Moore lay in his yard, muttering confessions to invisible judges. And Jacob was nowhere. Search parties found his footprints in the swamp, but only for a few yards. After that, the tracks simply stopped, as if he walked into the air. One searcher claimed he saw a figure in the tree line, tall and unmoving. Another swore she heard chains dragging though none were visible. By the second day, federal agents arrived. They seized documents, burned barns, and threatened anyone who spoke. Pastor Hammond refused to remain silent. He preached a sermon titled, "The Day Judgment Walked Among Us." He was found dead the next morning. The official cause, heart failure. The unofficial truth. He had written a final sentence in his ledger, found clutched in his hand. Jacob did not vanish. He returned to where memory lives. The ledger was destroyed by authorities, but a young choir boy copied the sentence before it burned. He grew into an old man, and he told the story until the day he died. After 1856, something strange happened in Rutherford County. Whenever cruelty rose, whenever injustice peaked, whenever a man used his power to crush another, people claimed to see a tall figure watching from the tree line. Never speaking, never approaching, just watching. Chains dragging softly across soil. Old families whispered warnings. Do not harm the innocent. Do not strike the weak. For Jacob Terrell walks at night. His name became a curse among violent men and a prayer among the oppressed. Some believed he was a spirit. Some believed he was an avenger. Some believed he was a man who simply refused to die. But the truth was simpler. Jacob represented the one thing America tried hardest to bury: the memory of suffering, carried generation to generation until it becomes stronger than fear, stronger than chains, stronger than any man born of cruelty. The plantation eventually collapsed. Moore died alone, terrified of the dark. But Jacob's legend grew, because legends only fade when the truth they carry is no longer needed. And America would need Jacob's truth for a long time. In 1923, a government archivist discovered a sealed envelope marked S3 in a Washington basement. Inside were burned fragments of Jacob's early records. One note, mostly intact, read, "Subject demonstrates resistance to fear stimuli. Subject retains ancestral memory beyond biological expectation." Another fragment read, "If released, subject may reflect, dangerously, the nation's unresolved sins." The archivist submitted a report. The next day, the file disappeared. He was advised not to ask questions, but he remembered something odd. The envelope smelled faintly of river mud. And for weeks afterward, he dreamed of a tall man standing in the marsh, chains floating around him like reeds. In the dream, the man never moved. He only watched. The archivist retired early. He told no one the full truth, but he kept one sentence from the file, hidden in his desk until his death. Subject cannot be erased, only avoided. America had tried to forget Jacob Terrell, but forgetting him meant forgetting everything that created him, and that was impossible. Today, historians rarely mention 1856. Churches deny involvement. Families claim amnesia. Government files remain sealed. But the story persists because it speaks to something deeper, a truth older than the plantation, older than the nation, older than the men who tried to bury it. Jacob Terrell was not a monster, not a myth, not an experiment gone wrong. He was the embodiment of everything America inflicted yet could not break. Strength born not from violence, but from survival, from memory, from the weight of generations that refused to disappear. The 12 overseers failed not because Jacob was superhuman, but because accountability is the one force no man can outrun. Jacob left behind no grave, no bones, no records. Only stories whispered in the dark. Stories of chains split by bare hands. Of a man who walked through walls of fear and left them trembling behind him. Of a presence that watches still. And if you ever find yourself near the forked Deer River on a quiet night, if the trees fall silent, if you hear iron dragging through the leaves, remember, some truths do not stay buried. Some memories do not fade. And some men, especially the ones the world tried hardest to erase, Never stop walking.